In December 1943, a military doctor pulled a white sheet over the face of a 20-year-old soldier. Double pneumonia, no pulse, no breath. By every measurement available in a military hospital in Texas, 20 minutes later, the doctor came back to sign the death certificate. George Ritchie was sitting up. What happened in those 20 minutes is what Raymond Moody spent the next 50 years of his life trying to understand. And what he found, collected from 150 separate people who had never met each other, is the reason the phrase near-death experience now appears in medical literature on 6 continents. Raymond Moody was not a believer. He was a philosopher. When he first heard George Ritchie's account in a classroom at the University of Virginia in the mid-1960s, Moody was a graduate student, studying Plato, formal logic, and the precise nature of what counts as evidence. He had spent years learning exactly which claims required exactly which kinds of proof.
He didn't believe the story, but he wrote it down.
Because something in Ritchie's account, the clinical specificity of it, the fact that a grown man with medical training was describing it without hesitation, without embellishment, without the performance of someone trying to convince you of something, wouldn't let him close the notebook. Ritchie described leaving his body, looking down at it from above the hospital room, moving through what he could only call a tunnel, encountering a presence of light that communicated without words, experiencing a review of his own life, not as memory, but as something he lived again from the outside, feeling what every other person had felt because of him, every wound, every moment of warmth. And then a boundary, a point he understood he could not cross. And then he was back, in a body that had been covered with a sheet and left for dead. Moody wrote down one question that night. Had anyone else described this? That question became his life's work.
The answer came slowly, then all at once. Moody began collecting accounts the way a scientist collects data, carefully, methodically, without deciding in advance what he intended to find. He interviewed people who had survived cardiac arrests, people who had been revived after accidents, people who had been declared clinically dead and brought back by the medicine that was only just becoming capable of doing so. He expected variation. Human experience is individual. Memory is unreliable. People reconstruct what they recall through the lens of what they already believe. What he found instead was a pattern. 150 people, different ages, different backgrounds, different religious beliefs, different countries, different decades, different medical circumstances. None of them had read each other's accounts. Most of them had never encountered the idea of a near-death experience. There was no name for it yet, and yet they described the same things. A sensation of leaving the body, looking down at a physical form that no longer felt like theirs, moving through darkness toward light, encountering presences, sometimes recognized as deceased relatives, sometimes as something they couldn't name, something that communicated knowledge without language. A review of their life, experienced from the outside, feeling the full weight of every significant moment they had caused in another person, every choice, every silence.
And then a boundary, a point they understood they were not permitted to cross. The knowledge, not the belief, the knowledge that they had to return. And then they were back, in bodies that had been, by every clinical instrument in the room, not alive. Think about what that pattern requires you to accept. 150 people describing the same structural sequence, independently, without access to each other's accounts. In an era before near-death experiences were a cultural idea, before they appeared in films, before they circulated online, before anyone had given this thing a name. In 1975, Raymond Moody gave it a name. He called it a near-death experience. His book, Life After Life, was published that year. It contained the accounts, the pattern, the careful, documented evidence that something was happening at the edge of death that medicine had not yet looked at directly. It sold 13 million copies. And it cost him something. Something that took decades to rebuild.
In 1975, American medicine treated death as a problem to be solved, not a phenomenon to be studied. Consciousness was a product of the brain. When the brain stopped functioning, consciousness stopped. This was not a hypothesis. It was the foundation that modern neuroscience was built on. You did not publish a book suggesting that foundation might be incomplete. Not if you wanted to keep your colleagues. Not if you wanted grants. Not if you wanted the professional credibility that allows a researcher to do research. Not if you wanted any of the things that a career in medicine requires you to protect. And here was Raymond Moody, a philosopher with a medical degree, not a cardiologist, not a neuroscientist, not a credentialed expert in any field that could claim ownership of this territory, publishing a book that said 150 people had described conscious experience during periods when their brains were not functioning. The medical establishment did not engage with the evidence. It simply decided the evidence was impossible and treated the man who collected it accordingly. But Moody didn't stop.
Because the accounts kept arriving. Not because he was seeking them, because the people who had survived cardiac arrests, the people who had been revived from clinical death and then tried to describe what had happened, had nowhere else to take what they were carrying.
Their doctors didn't want to hear it. Their families were frightened by it. Their priests were uncertain how to place it within frameworks built for the living. And Raymond Moody was the one person who had said publicly, in print, with his name on the cover, "I believe something is happening here. Tell me what you saw." That willingness to stand in the space between what the evidence was producing and what the institution was willing to discuss is what the next 50 years of near-death experience research rests on. Sam Parnia's AWARE study, the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, Peter Fenwick's work in the United Kingdom, the formal peer-reviewed science of consciousness at the edge of death. Every serious scientific investigation into this territory begins, in some way, with the notebook Raymond Moody kept as a philosophy student in the mid-1960s. One man, one notebook, 50 years. And the question that medicine is only now taking seriously enough to fund.
Now I need to address the most obvious counterargument directly, because if I don't, you should be skeptical of everything else in this video. The skeptic's argument goes like this. Raymond Moody was not a scientist. He was a collector of stories. Stories are not data. People who survive near-death experiences are not objective witnesses. They are people in extreme physiological and psychological states, whose memories are shaped by what their culture has told them death looks like, by the desperate human need to believe that the people they have lost have not simply stopped existing. This is a legitimate argument, and I want to be precise about what it can and cannot explain. It can explain individual accounts. A person who grew up hearing about tunnels and light might reconstruct a tunnel and light. Memory is reconstructive. Expectation shapes experience. These are documented, reproducible psychological phenomena.
Here is what the argument struggles to explain. The accounts Moody collected in the 1960s and early 1970s came largely from people who had never heard the phrase near-death experience, who had never read a book describing these structural elements, who had no widely available cultural template for what they were expected to experience at the edge of death. And yet, they described the same sequence, independently, without access to each other, that people describe today. The cultural expectation argument requires the expectation to exist before the experience. For many of Moody's earliest subjects, the expectation didn't exist. The account came first.
Raymond Moody has never claimed that his work proves consciousness survives physical death. What he has said, consistently, across 50 years of collecting and defending this research, is more precise than that.
He has said that these accounts, their structural consistency, their independence from each other, their appearance across cultures with no shared expectation, represent a genuine phenomenon that medicine has not yet adequately explained, and that the explanation, whatever it turns out to be, will require medicine to revise what it currently believes about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. That is not a man promising you that death is not the end. That is the man who named near-death experiences, who has spent 50 years inside the evidence, saying that the question itself is now legitimate, that it cannot be dismissed by assumption, that something is happening at the edge of death that our current models were not built to account for. And here is the thing that Moody's 50 years of work forces you to sit with. You will reach the edge of death. Everyone you have ever loved will reach it. The question of what happens there is not abstract. It is not academic. It is the most personal question that exists. And the only honest thing Raymond Moody ever said about it, after 50 years of the closest examination of that question that any single researcher has sustained, is that the accounts of 150 people describing the same impossible thing independently deserve to be taken seriously, and that we have only just begun to look.
Subscribe, because next week we go to the one element of near-death experiences that appears consistently across every major study, every major researcher, every cultural background examined: the life review. Survivors describe reliving every moment of their lives, not as memory, but as direct experience, feeling what every other person felt because of them. Every choice they made, every wound they left, every moment of warmth they gave without knowing it was received. And no researcher who has studied it has found an adequate neurological explanation for how a brain in crisis produces that level of organized, sequential, emotionally complete reconstruction. Short-sighted.
That case is next.
You already know something most people spend their whole lives avoiding.
That is not nothing. That is the beginning.